All right, friends. This is week 3, lecture 3, November 9th. We've got a couple housekeeping things, discussion questions due by Sunday, as always. And you do have a core assignment of to-do list that is due Sunday. These are both 11:59 p.m. PDT. To-do list was already done with you. Oops, wrong one. Sorry. This one was already done with you, so that's here, this lecture. On our 11:17 or 11:7, sorry. It's like, oh no, I didn't mess up the dates. 11:7 right here. This YouTube, that was with Robert and Garrett. So make sure that you check that out if you're having some troubles with this to-do list assignment. Just a little bit of a recap. We talked about promises yesterday, right? Promises return 3 things to us, 2 big things. Anybody remember what the 2 big things that promises return to us are? My mouse just died right as I was doing that. Okay. Ooh, this is gonna be a struggle. My mouse. Wow, what a tough day. Okay, we're gonna just go rock it. So promises return 3 things, but 2 main things. We go to our actual learn platform, and we look at our APIs. We can talk about promises. It's not just something that people break. Promises return 3 things, right? They return pending. Let us know, okay, this is pending. It returns resolved and rejected. Does anybody remember what are some benefits of promises? Anybody know? So yeah, Johnny, kind of like a status, but it gives us pending, it gives us resolved and rejected. But what were the benefits? What were we talking about? And if you were an office hour, you kind of saw maybe why a promise would be a good thing for us to utilize. Any guesses? Yeah, it allows us to check an API, but it allows us to do it in a way that is asynchronous, right? Allows us to do it in a way that if we are calling code or we're calling for an API, we don't have to wait in the same way that JavaScript natively is synchronous, meaning it goes line by line by line. A promise allows us to have an asynchronous code flow, meaning that we can call the API, and while we're waiting on that response, we can go and do other things. We can load other things. Our user doesn't know that, hey, we're waiting for this information. In office hour, Johnny showed us some fun stuff with the Star Wars API, but we were realizing that the Star Wars API, if you just call like species or planets, we were kind of racking our brain of like, why is this not console logging? Why is this not working? What is going on? And I think, Johnny, we probably spent, I don't know, 20, 30 minutes trying to figure out and pinpoint. And really what the issue was is we expected it to be pretty quick. And we realized our response was actually taking 15, 30, 40 seconds, especially when we were doing like the planets one. They were taking a long time, right? And so this asynchronous code is really beneficial because we're able to go do other things while this is taking a long time, and it allows us to make it seem like, you know, hey, this is pretty quick, but we've already got that information and we can disperse it however we want. So that's a big thing with promises. We also talked about Axios, and Axios is going to be a tool that we can use to actually call APIs. Now, it is a built-in method that allows us to say, hey, JavaScript, I want you to go to this base URL plus whatever we add on. So any sort of uniqueness, if it's /planets or /people, I want you to go and I want you to grab some information. I want to give, basically we're the carrier and we are giving our request. Axios is giving the request and then it's waiting for a response back. And so it's a great tool that we can use. The other one that we can use as well would be Fetch. I think it's in consuming API. Sorry about that. We could use Fetch. Now, we're going to talk about fetch using await and async in the future, week 7 and 8. Moving forward, we're going to be using Axios. So I encourage you to actually just kind of skip this section. If you want to look at it, that's great. But moving forward, we are going to be using Axios. And lastly, we talked about APIs and API calls. And again, it's just some information that maybe a company has. Some companies, this is all they do is they have APIs. Others, they say, hey, we have this tool that is really useful for us. It would probably be useful for other people. Let's make this a thing. APIs is a really common thing in the workplace. When I worked with a company that did like IoT data, what we would do is we actually had all of this data that we were collecting from workers, and we had all this information, and the company wanted the data themselves, right? Because we presented it in a dashboard and said, okay, here's our manipulations. Here's the things we did. They said, okay, that's great. We love this. This is awesome. Can we also get access to the information? If I want to see a specific user and how much they did X, Y, or Z, can I do that? The way we did that was an API, right? So we set it up and said, cool, here's your endpoint, really your base URL. Here's what you're going to call. They're going to change the information. We set it up to where they could actually search a name, but in the background, all we're doing is making a call to our API, to our data, grabbing that by their unique identifier, which is like ID, which we're going to get to next week when we start talking about routing. And then we would retrieve that information for them. It was super easy, but that's like a real use case situation on how an API is going to be really beneficial for you. It's not just making your project look good. Lots of your projects will become APIs, will become things that other companies are going to want to call and utilize within their own programs or within their own applications. So it's going to be something that's really popular. Cool. So kind of now moving forward, we've got some fun stuff, and I left today pretty light in regards, because we're just going to kind of mess around with some code. We're going to mess around, see how Axios works, get the breakdown. We're going to use what we call a side effect. It's just another hook of React called use effect that can act in a pretty fun way. And then we're going to see how does that work with the Star Wars API. How can we actually take all this information, this Axios, this use effect, these promises that we've talked about, and how do we actually go implement, grab information? How do we reflect that onto our screen? So that's what we'll be doing today. Are there any questions before we jump in and get started? Any questions at all? Small class today. Maybe people are watching Thursday night football. Okay, then we'll jump in and get started. As always, feel free to raise your hand. Honestly, there's only a few people here, so feel free to come off mute if you have a question. It's a little easier for me as well, too, if you guys come off mute or have something you want to add in there today. Okay, so I have already created, because we've done it a few times, because we've already used Vite a million times now. You guys, I'm not going to make you painfully sit there and see, this is how you install Vite. We've already done that. So I created a new project called API. And in that, I not only did our npm install, but I did install one more thing. And so if I go into my package JSON, I can see that I've got now this new dependency called Axios. So now I can utilize this package, this library. All you have to do in order to install Axios is in the same spot where you cd into your new Vite project. I called this API, so I did cd API. And where you say npm install or npm I, after you do that, then all you have to do is say npm install Axios. What that's going to do is that's just going to install Axios. So you can see the npm install Axios. It's going to add in these packages. It'll say that they're looking for funding. You don't have to do that. That's really just people are saying, hey, I'm doing the stuff that you're using. Why don't you pay me? Buy me a cup of coffee. You can do that if you like, but not necessary. And then you're good to go, right? And then in your now moving forward in your dependencies are just for this project, not moving forward in other projects. Because we're, again, not doing this globally. We're restricting this to the scope of each project. So that way it can be within our dependencies. So now we can actually utilize Axios. Great. I haven't done anything more than that. So let's go ahead and build out some different, let's go build out some different things. Or sorry, this without a mouse is killing me. Using my touchpad. Okay. So for right now, we don't really need to do a ton. So I'm just going to build it within the app JSX. But if you wanted to modularize it and you wanted to, kind of make it a little bit different, you totally can. Like basically having your own components. Okay. Great. So I'm in my app JSX. Right. There's a couple things I know that I'm going to need. I'm going to import. I'm going to import use effect. And that's a new term that we're learning today. We're going to talk about that here in just a second. And also use state. Perfect. And then I want to import that from React. Perfect. Now, you might say, what on earth is use effect? Use effect is another synthetic hook. In the same way that use state is, use effect is a hook that we're going to use. That is what we call a side effect. Now, or it helps us manage, side effects in our React projects. But it is a hook. It's a React hook. And there's this idea of mounting a component that we haven't talked about. So let's kind of talk about that first. We've talked about in a long, when we first talked about React, that we have this idea of this virtual DOM that's constantly checking with our DOM, with our document object model, right? And saying, hey, does this match up, or is there a change that needs to happen? Well, when we add in a component, so let's say I click on something and I want a component to show up. Once that component is added in, we call that mounting. You can think about it like if I've got my virtual DOM, and then I've got my real DOM. And then I'm going to have a whole bunch of components. You can go like this. Right? I am adding, it's checking and saying, do these match up? Are these, am I up to date? Do I need to replace anything? Let's say that I've got this component here that I want to add on to my DOM, which then comes here. When it goes and is shown, right? When it's added to that, that is what we call being mounted, right? And that's kind of like when you're dealing with class-based components, we're going to actually have to manually handle that. But for functional-based components, you don't have to worry about it. But this is called being mounted. Basically, it is visible. It is part of this. It is now part of the DOM. When we click out and we replace it, which is the power of components, right? And I want something else. We went from planets to maybe people when we're dealing with the Star Wars API. And it comes off, that is, as you guessed, unmounting. Mounting and unmounting, right? Mounting is when it's added on. Unmounting is when it's added off. You might say, okay, what is the point of knowing all of those words? Well, let me cancel this. Sorry. I clicked out of my annotate. Okay. So when we're dealing with use effect is a tool that we can do that if we want, once a component comes up, maybe I want anything to happen. It doesn't have to just be with APIs. One thing to kind of note, use effect can be really anything. We use it very frequently with APIs, but if I wanted it to say 5+5, whenever a component's mounted, I can make it do that as well. It's just a hook that we can use to do something, oftentimes, again, paired with an API. But really the power of it is if we want something to happen when a component is mounted, when they look for people, and I want to go then automatically call an API and get all of my people, use effect will allow that. It is a hook that upon mounting, automatically run some code. That's kind of the overarching big thing that you have to know about it. So let's go ahead and write that now. So we bring it in, right? We bring it in up here. Then within my function, but before my return, I'm going to say use effect. It is a higher order function, so it takes in a callback function, right? And all I want it to do is I want it to maybe alert this as ran. Cool, and then let's close it. Now, there's two things that are happening here. Let me finish this, perfect. And you say use. Perfect, we'll do that. So there's two things happening here. When this component, and this is our base component, so when this is mounted, when we first are going to our screen, this is going to run immediately, right? Or whatever is within this. In this case, again, we just have an alert, but we'll work our way up to an API call. What's between these curly brackets is, well, what do you want use effect to do? When this is mounted or when this is ran, what do you want it to do? The second thing is what we call a dependency array. A dependency array. Now, there's a couple things with the dependency array. What this allows us to do is if something changes on our screen. So let's say you're going to, when we get next week into routing, there's a great assignment called Luke Walker API or Luke Skywalker API or something like that. That we can have some information, right? It's going to have basically a form. You're going to have an ID. And once that changes, maybe you want it to rerun and grab some information. What this bracket or this dependency array does is allows us to set a condition on when we want this to run again. So it'll run at the beginning. And if we want it to constantly be updating or calling our API, or again, do an alert, something on our page, we can put it into that. We can put that aspect in my dependency array. And once that happens, it will automatically rerun. So let's say I have a piece of state called ID. And I want to call that, and I want to do an API call, and I want to have that at the end of my route. I can say, hey, if this state ever changes, if somewhere on my website, a user changes the state, let's go ahead and rerun this and grab the new information. Now, one thing to really note is if we don't want to put an item in our dependency array that in itself is changing within our use effect. This is a huge thing. Let's say I said something like this, right? Let's say that I had some sort of state. This is just to show you, like, definitely don't do this. Okay, let's just say this data thing. That's fine. And then what if I said something like set data to this? Now, this is already giving me an issue, but what's going to happen if I were to put data here and I were to run this? This is going to run immediately, right? Then we are setting the data. It runs this and we say, hey, whenever data changes, I want you to rerun this use effect. Well, knowing that when we set the data, what happens? The data changes. So then once the data changes, it automatically calls my use effect. And so then my use effect comes in and it sets data. It does an alert. But what happens is when it's dependent and it's running, when this changes, this is changing again. And so you get into an infinite loop of constant use effect calls and then your computer breaks. That's how this works. So one thing to note is anytime you are dealing or adding in something to your dependency array, make sure it is not changing within your use effect. Because if that happens, it's going to just be a constant. You're never going to get out of it, right? It can never leave itself because the thing that is changing it is the use effect, and the use effect changes every time it changes, and then it just is a cyclical cycle. So that's just something to be aware of. For right now, for what we're doing, we can just keep this empty for right now. Keep this empty, and then we can kind of set that later. Cool. So we have this, I'm just going to say div API walk. Cool. Okay. It's just saying that it doesn't like that I just have one child. Do another div. There you go. Because we don't like squiggly lines. Okay. So now if I go to my terminal, I need to cd and then I'm going to cd into nov. Or 23 week 3 lecture 3 API. And I say npm run dev. Let's go check out what happens. 5173. And I say localhost 5173. I get this alert immediately that use effect has ran. Because the component, the initial component of our app was mounted. This gave an alert, it ran. Perfect. Now, sometimes it will do it twice, and that's because we have strict mode on. So if you look in our code, I think it's in the index.html. Nope, sorry. We have the strict mode, and so sometimes it runs twice. So let's just be aware of that. But we see that this, now we get this API walkthrough 2. If I reroute or redo this, we remount, right? Because we're refreshing our DOM, it remounts all of our components. We get this use effect, it's automatically running. And then we actually see that. So I'm gonna pause there. Are there any questions on use effect? What we're doing with it, how it works? Any questions there? Okay. Well, let's add in use effect with some sort of API. So we're going to be using our Star Wars API that we love. I'm going to be honest, I'm not a big Star Wars person. Like, I like it. I don't like, it's not ride or die, but I know a lot of people like it. So we'll rock with it. Okay. So we know that, does anybody remember what this is called? What is this portion of the API called? Talked about it yesterday. Anybody remember it all?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, what do you call this portion of when we're calling an API? So if calling an endpoint's a good idea, right? An API endpoint, but this is our base, right? This is our base route, our base URL, meaning that anytime you call this API, it's always going to start with this, right? That's our base URL. Then you want to add on to it in the same way that, remember, if we talked about RESTful routing yesterday, where we want to keep it consistent. We want to make it easier for our users to, and ourselves and anybody that's messing with our code to understand what we're trying to do. So we have the same base URL and we just add on accordingly. Cool. So we grab this, we know this, perfect. Now let's actually go and make a call. Well, I want to use our tool called Axios, right? So what I first have to do, I've already installed it. We saw that on my package.json. I then need to import it. So though it's installed, I want to go ahead and import it. And the way that we do that is we say import Axios from Axios. Pretty self-explanatory. Now, this keyword of Axios, I can utilize that within my code and it knows what I'm talking about. So what I can do is I can say, excuse me, Axios dot. Now, remember, dot get is me just retrieving information. That is the reading of our CRUD. So I'm gonna say Axios dot get. I want to then pass it my API, my base route of my API. And for right now, I just want to say people, and I'm going to just give it 1. I just want to get that information. I'm going to go get, I think it's probably Luke Skywalker. I'm going to go grab that information. It gives me 2 things. It gives me a dot then. I'm going to do that. And I can do a dot catch. I like to always have a dot catch because there has been times where I have banged my head against a wall trying to understand why my code does not work. And if I would have gotten a dot catch, I would have seen what the error was and I could have fixed it a long time ago. So let's look at this. We have our Axios. We use our HTTP verb of .get and saying, hey, go to this API here. Grab this information. That is a request, right? We're requesting our program to go to an API and say, hey, can you give me the information at this base URL /people/1? It gives us back a response. And so if everything is good, if it worked out well, then it goes into this dot then, right? This is that resolved that we talked about with our, when we talked about promises. Dot then represents resolved. Hey, this was completed successfully. Dot catch is no, this was rejected for some reason. So you can sort of think about those two as the same thing, right? Rejected is dot catch. Resolved is dot then. We have some information in this and we have that response. That's what it gives us back, right? Well, I want to do something with that information. I just want to console log it. I want to apply this and I want to console log it. Vice versa, if I get an error back, then what do I want to do with it? I just want to console log the error. Great. So now if I save this, I go to my page and I inspect, I get my console and I refresh. You can see that I have now this data, right? I've got this data here that has all of this information. When I open it up, it's got a whole bunch of stuff. And so here I've got, it gives me all this, and then I have this data here, this data key, and it's really kind of the information that we want, right? Name, mass, height, hair color, etc., films, all that stuff. So what I can do is if I look at this and I understand how my API works, I understand what my response is, I understand what it's going to give me back, I can actually handle this a little bit better. That's again where this postman comes in, really testing your APIs before you grab and sort of manipulate or grab any of the information. You can do this. You know, you can test and see what it's going to give us back. But I see that there's something there within my res or my response. I can call that kind of anything. And I want the .data. Right? So if I refresh, now, instead of getting all that information that I maybe don't need, I actually just get the data. Right? I'm able to go in and I can see the name, I can see the object, I can see the mass, hair color, all that stuff. So what might I do if I wanted to maybe show this information? What might I want to do here? Need access to this data. What could I do? I want to show this maybe in like a P tag or something. Exactly, Brittany, you're 100% right. I can use my use state. So let's go ahead and go to use state. Let's get rid of this data one. Doesn't make sense. So let's say const. And then let's say character, set character. And we're going to set that to an empty object. We're just going to, hey, this is going to be an object. I don't have that information yet, but it's going to be an object. Now, instead of just console logging, which is great, doesn't really do anything for us though. I can say set character res.data. Within my dot then, I say set character res.data. Now, here, I could say a few things, right? I could grab in and say maybe character dot name, right? Let's see. See if this works. Yep, we get Luke Skywalker. So maybe I could say character name. And then maybe I want, let's see, what other data do we have access to? So funny. Thing, maybe like hair color. Maybe home planet was probably a better one. I think it gives us that. Let's see what my data gives me. Birth year, starship, species, name, home world is what it is. Okay. Now, when we have this, we can take in some more information, right? And get the home world. I can make another API call. It's a little bit advanced for what we're doing for this first portion of it, but I can do the same thing. I can use Axios to get more information there. Cool. So maybe I'll just say hair color and mass, because those are fine. Let's grab this. And remember the hotkey. Cool. So then again, I just say character dot hair color is what I think it is. Yep, we have blonde, and then we just have mass. I just say dot mass. Cool. Oops. So I'm able to grab that information. Now let's pretend that I changed that and somebody wanted to go to 6, right? Well, now all of a sudden you can see pretty quickly we get this information. Owen Lars, brown gray, mass is 120. And so this use effect allows us to call these APIs, grab some information, and change that accordingly. Cool. I'm going to stop there for right now. Are there any questions? You just put a 1 in the chat or a 5 in the chat if this makes sense. Put a 0 if it does not. Okay. So how can we put all of the stuff that we've sort of learned this week with map and filter, well, not really filter, but with map and use effect and Axios, how can we do all that? Well, let's go ahead and put this together and grab some information. I'm actually not going to use effect for this. I guess I can, but I want to show that you don't have to use. So again, Axios and use effect are individualistic. You don't have to use Axios with use effect in the same way that you don't have to use effect anytime you're using Axios, right? They both do their own thing. They're great together, but they both are independent of one another. So let's say that instead of having kind of this information, I wanted to, let's say I wanted to have a button that said, let's say I've got a P tag that says pick, or sorry, press to get first 10 people. And then I have a button that says press here. Perfect. I come here, right? Come here, I've got this press to get first 10 people and then press here. Perfect. So what I want to do is I want to grab it. Once somebody clicks on that, I want to grab the information. I want to go to my API. I want to grab some information and then I want to display that, right? So how can I do that? What would be my first step of me trying to do that? Anybody know? What do I need to change kind of first and foremost? If you were approaching this, if I were to say, hey, give me a P tag and a button, and once it's clicked, I want to go get the first 10 and then I want to display them. What do I need to do in order to keep track of all my people? Yeah, Brittany, exactly. I need to have some sort of characters or character list. Exactly, Shifkat. I need an array. So I'm going to come here. I'm going to take out this character. And maybe I'm just going to say const. Yeah, we could do people, set people, and it's an array, right? I'm grabbing, or I'm going to have an array of objects. I'm still going to have objects just like I had, right? I'm just going to grab that information. Cool. Well, we want this to be when it's clicked, I want to go grab that information. So what can we do? We've done this before. What can we do to go and get that information? Or to make that happen? Yeah, exactly, Brittany. I need an on click, right? So we can, if we go down to my button, I can do something like on click equals, and maybe I want to say get characters. Perfect. So here I need to create that get characters, right? So I'm going to say const get characters. Now, what do I want to do? I want to axios.get. And I know just by us kind of messing with it, that in office hour, that whenever we say slash people slash planets slash spaceships, I think is one of them, it gives us a list. It gets a whole bunch, but it really just gives us the first 10. So by doing this, I know that my response will be that. But again, a way to test that is to go into my Postman. We were testing that with species earlier. Send. As this API in itself takes quite a long time, so keep waiting. This is where also Postman's great. So that's what we ended up doing, was checking and saying, well, how long is it taking in Postman? This took 6 seconds, which doesn't seem like that long of a time, but it actually is quite a long time. But we have 82 people. And if you look at the results, this is really just 10 objects here. Cool. So we know that we've tested it. We're good to go. So I know that I'm going to get a response. If everything goes well, if this is read correctly, then I'm going to get a response. Right? And that is gonna, what do I want to do with that response then? So if I just first console log, I want to say res.data. That's all I want to do right now because that's what we did initially. Let's just console log res.data. Let's do my little curly boy here. And then let's do our .catch. Perfect. have an extra parenthesis right there. Cool. So if everything works a-okay and we get characters, we're going to get a response, and I want to console log the response.data, which is what we just did, right? That's what we did earlier. If there's an error, then I want to console log the error. And I just make sure swappy.dev/API/people. I go to swappy.dev API/people. Okay, we're good to go. So now this is not running immediately. This is not running once it's mounted, right? This is just running when this is clicked. So let's go to my website. We refresh. There's an error. Looks like I have an extra curly bracket, or does that match? Does that match? Yes, 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 yes. Ah, I do not have a pair for my get characters. So let's go ahead and do that. Now
And
we're
we
good.
also have a good question in chat, Will. Brittany asked, why are we only getting the first 10 back on that API call? And I believe we might cover that during office hour when
Yeah,
for everybody here.
yeah, great question. So that's actually the way the API is set up. So sometimes when we're using APIs, we're set up to where how they're going to give us data. What they do is they give you a next page. And so each page and in the documentation, correct me if I'm wrong, Johnny, but in the documentation, it says, hey, we're going to give you 10 and then we'll give you the next page. And so we just do it to 10 per page. And so that's how we're getting the first 10. And that's just because we know the API and the data. It could be something different. They could give you all of them at once. That would work just fine. But for what we know, and because we know this API, we know it's the first 10. So that's why. But yeah, we talked about that in office hours. So if you, I don't think you were there, so it makes a lot of sense. So great question. Cool. So now if we go to our project and we press here, see how it's orange. Now we had to wait a second, right? So we saw that, hey, this maybe wasn't the most fun because we had to wait 5 seconds, and that doesn't sound like a lot, but it is. And we got some information, but we see that there's this results here. And this results is a array of our, oops, another prototype, of all of the objects. And this is what we want, right? So if I were to come here and instead do dot results as well, so just going deeper into my object or my response, I refresh and I press. I still wait a second. I still wait a second. Now I just get this information, right? And so what I could do is I could say, yeah, very suspenseful, exactly. Instead of just console logging, I could say set people to data or res.data.results. So I'm saying I want to set this array of my state of people to this array that I'm getting back. So now I have all of these people in state. I save that. We're good to go. Perfect. Now we've completed that portion of it. If I were to, let's just make sure so that way we know. I press here. We're waiting. We're waiting. We're waiting. We get that, but I come here. I go to my components. I see I'm in my app. I have my state, and we see that, okay, cool. My state is populated. We did get it well, or everything is working as accordingly. Okay, we're good to go. Don't sleep on this React developer tools, especially when you're like, man, this is supposed to show up. Why is this not showing up? Always check these tools because they'll help you kind of be like, oh, okay, well, it's not showing up in state. So maybe the way I said it, or did I forget to put it in state? Things like that. Okay. So now what I want to do is I want to show maybe all that information. Maybe there's just the names. So what I can do, just get rid of that, is I can use our .map, our .map function to say, hey, of my array of people, I want to map through them. I'm going to call this person, and I is my key, right? Or that's my key. That's my index, right? Remember, it gives you the item, the index. And does anybody remember the third thing that maps gives you? Or map gives you, not maps. Sorry, map gives you three things. Gives you the item itself, the index, and not just an array, Brittany, but the whole array. But yeah, exactly. Great job, right? It gives you the whole array. I'm saying I want to return just a p tag. It gives you this key of I, and then just really person name. So let's save this. I refresh this, and now immediately you see that I get some information. I get some information. I refresh this, nothing happens, right? We're good to go. But once I click it, I call my API, and then it automates my state, and then I can iterate through that using map. Cool. Now, one thing you can do is do an implicit return. And so you actually don't have to return here. And instead of doing a curly boy, you just do this. Oops. That guy, and then you do this. And so now you don't have to put that return keyword. And it'll do the same thing. So now it's a little bit easier for you to, like, if I wanted to say another p tag, a key of, but I wanted to do person dot mass. I don't know. So don't think I need to keep her. See, what is my error gonna be?
I think you just need to throw it in a div or a.
Oh, yeah, you're right. I need to do a div. And move these guys up into it. Oh, sorry guys. This no mouse is killing me. Perfect. Believe. Cool. So now you see that I can get all of this information, right? And I can start adding in more and more things. If I wanted to show that, I can do that. Refresh one more time so we can see the code. Press here. Our on click hits our Axios call, and we get all of our information. Maybe I'll say person name. Might look a little bit nicer. Cool. Now, again, I don't have to, if I'm going to use Axios, I don't have to put it in a use effect. In the same way that I can call use effect and just say to do an alert or to do 5+5. It'll do that, right? They don't have to be hand in hand, but they are really, really well, they work really well together. And that's what we're going to do for most of the API calls that we do will be with use effect just at the beginning. Okay, I'm going to pause there. Are there any questions on promises, on use effect, on Axios of actually calling APIs, grabbing that information, putting it in state, showing that using map? Any questions at all? That's all I've got for tonight.
So the way that you just did it, you didn't use effect, you just called a function.
Yep, I just called a function. So I just on my on click, That's what called this function, which had Axios in there.
And what would be the difference if you did use effect?
So use effect. So great question, Brittany. This function only calls when this button is clicked. Use effect, if I would have just done use effect, will go and grab that information immediately once that component is mounted. So let's say I didn't want it to show until my person actually clicked, like reveal whatever information, right? Well, use effect automatically runs once it's mounted in the way that we've set it up by having this empty dependency array. This is dependent on the user actually clicking. So that would be the big difference. So if I were to, and I can show you, I guess we can kind of view it, right? So let's say the user comes to my site for the first time. This is what they're going to see, right? This is what they're going to see forever until they click here. Now that they click here, it calls that function and it prompts the Axios call, gets the information, and now shows that in our code, right? Let's comment this out. Had I taken this information and put it up here, now my code is saved. Yep. Now we'll see once I refresh the page, it automatically shows up. It automatically runs that. But it took a second because the API call is actually pretty slow. The Swappy API in itself is slow. But if I just refresh this, automatically happens. We have state, and the state gets populated, and then it shows up here. So use effect is, let's say I wanted to get a list of users or friends, right? Or I know that I'm going to want to grab some information from our user to see. That's where use effect comes in. Or let's say that, again, the dependency array, if I leave it empty, then that's going to only run when this is mounted and not any other time, unless we refresh and it remounts, right? The dependency array, I can add in another piece of information. We're going to really explore this when we start talking about routing and request parameters. When that changes, then I can set up my use effect to say, hey, if this changes, then let's go ahead and run this use effect again. But for right now, for what we've done, leaving this empty makes this code run upon mounting of a component, and then it stops. Right? It doesn't run another time unless we remount/refresh. This gave us a little bit more flexibility to where, okay, great. We can, we're going to run that Axios call only when the user clicks on the button. But I would agree with Joseph. That was a great question. Great clarification. Does that help? Does that make a little bit more clarification there?
Yeah, that was great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure. Are there any other questions? Those are great questions. How are we feeling with use effect and Axios? Are there any other questions, Fritz? Okay. Well, just to recap, we talked about use effect, which is a new hook that we're introducing. We talked about how we can manipulate state with use effect /Axios. We introduced this tool called Axios that, again, I would encourage you, if you're wanting to start using API calls, you can go ahead and skip this idea of fetch and just move straight on to Axios. If you do want to do fetch, we talked about this yesterday, but a big difference, not a big difference, but one of the differences is that Axios itself will give you a response that is JSONified, meaning that it's a JSON object notation, meaning that it's an object, how we've seen it, right? If you decide to use fetch, which you can, it's totally up to you. I will be using Axios. It's just easier. You have to JSONify the response first before you start doing it. So it is an extra step. So just wanted to point that out. We talked about Axios, using it, how we just install it, and then we have to call it at the top. And once we do that, we can then use Axios to call our APIs for us. It gives us a couple things. It gives us our resolved, and it gives us a rejected that we call .then and .catch. And let me just show you even what a let's say, I want to, well, I guess it doesn't matter because it's not going to work. I want to show you what a .catch is going to do. So that way we can see how this works. Go to my console. And if I refresh, nothing there, but I get this Axios error. So this is what's returned to us when we get a rejection. And we can read this error and say, okay, request failed with status code 404. Error is bad request, meaning, hey, 404 cannot find that. Really, we try to look for a person with an ID of whatever that is, 5 million or 50 million or a billion or whatever. And they didn't have that. So we get this error. That's what this .catch did. So Cotton said, hey, this response could not be filled. It was rejected. And we just console logged it. And so this is what Axios is going to give us. Request failed with status code 404. Axios error. Here's the actual code itself. Is error bad request. So Axios, that is our rejected and resolved from our promise. Again, this is all happening asynchronously. In using useEffect, the last thing I will kind of reiterate is if we do anything in our dependency array, that's fine. We will do that. Just make sure the thing in your dependency array does not change within your useEffect, or else you're in for it. Then just pray to the heavens that your computer doesn't light on fire. So just that's the one thing. It's definitely don't put anything, if you're going to put something in your dependency array, which again, we're going to talk more about in the next week when we talk about routing and IDs and stuff. But if you're messing with that now, your computer breaks, just know that you probably had the one thing, because whatever goes in here spurs this to run again. So if we would have put people and we're setting people, well, people is changing. So then it runs the useEffect again, and then it sets people so that it puts into the stack, hey, you need to run the useEffect again. And then it just keeps going and going and going and going and going. And then nobody has fun there. You're already stressed. You're like, this isn't working. And then your computer's on fire. You have to buy a new computer. It's just a whole thing. At that point, you just have to
see
throw
a
it.
million console logs.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
the infinite console logs just running. You're like, oh shoot, my computer just like starts to slowly and it's
Yeah.
a fast computer, but you got to shut it down right away.
Yeah, exactly. At that point, just run to the fridge, grab some eggs, and just start cooking. Might as well have a benefit, might as well take some benefit in your computer catching on fire. So, but yeah, so just make sure if you're messing with that this weekend that you do not do that. But you probably will. But that's part of being a developer. You know how many times I have done that where I've had it like an infinite loop? A million times. I still do it to this day. And I go, well, dang it. I should have known that. So if you do that, say okay. Cool. That's what we've covered today. We're going to continue next week. Let's just take a little pop into next week. We're going to be talking about routing. Where we can start, and right now what we're doing is just, if we click on a button, or all of our components are kind of just showing up on our app, and that doesn't always happen, right? I don't always want to see everything all the time. I want to be able to, if I want to think about Facebook, like if I want to see my friends, I click on friends and then that component shows up. So we're going to start looking at what that routing does and how we can do that next week. And then we're going to introduce this idea of Express. This is our middleware. So this is, we're starting to introduce, okay, what does our backend look like? How do we start dealing with our both two different a client and a server, and we're going to have multiple servers. And so we're going to kind of step it up a little bit next week. But the good news for you guys is, but then you have a break week. And then it's Thanksgiving week, and then we get to eat a lot of food, and you don't have to worry about coding. This is a great time to catch up on any assignments or anything. You can't catch up on discussion questions, unfortunately, but this is a great time to catch up on that. I will, prior to this week, I will try to remember to open up discussion questions for weeks 5 through 8. I can't do it now because there's currently a class that is in, we basically run every 4 weeks. So they're in week 7 now. So if I affect it, then I affect them. So I can't do it now. So I can only do the first 4. But it's a great way to also kind of move forward. We have on the platform, you have all of the lectures that are available to you. Some that are mine, some that are other instructors. Everybody, we kind of teach on the same thing. Everybody just has a different style. But if you want to move on to week 5, you can see that there's already some instructors and already some stuff here. Some people like to draw. Some people have really nice other drawings, but they're all great. So if you wanted to move forward on that, you totally can. Great. Any other questions, friends? I know we're 3 minutes over, but any other questions? All right. Well, if there's no questions, that'll be it for me tonight. I hope you guys have a wonderful weekend. Good luck. Again, the to-do list, there's already a video here. So if you're really struggling with it, there's a video right there. We'll make sure this is up tonight, and then we will see you next week. I hope you guys have a great night. Take care.
I
Good night.